The morning sun cast long shadows across the downtown streets as Detective James Washington finished his coffee at the small diner on Fifth Avenue. He had been working late the night before, following up on a case that had been bothering him for weeks. As a 15-year veteran of the United States Secret Service, James had seen his share of complicated situations, but this particular threat assessment had kept him up most of the night. His phone buzzed against the table. The caller ID showed his supervisor's number. James picked up immediately. "Washington here. James, we need you downtown immediately. There's been a credible threat called in against Judge Mitchell. Someone phoned in specific details about his route to work this morning. We're taking it seriously." James felt his stomach tighten. Judge Mitchell was handling a high-profile case involving organized crime, and threats against federal judges were never taken lightly. "I'm about 10 minutes out. Should I meet the detail at the courthouse?" "Negative. We need you to check his usual morning route first. Take the path he normally drives from his house to the courthouse. Look for anything unusual. The local police are already aware, but we want federal eyes on this." James left a $5 tip on the table and headed for his personal car. He had been planning to stop by his apartment to change into his work clothes, but this couldn't wait. He was dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, his service weapon concealed beneath his jacket. His federal credentials and badge were in his wallet, as always. The drive through downtown was typical for a Tuesday morning. Traffic moved at its usual slow pace, with commuters heading to work and school buses making their rounds. James took the same route Judge Mitchell would use, scanning the sidewalks and buildings for anything that seemed out of place. Everything appeared normal until he reached the intersection of Main and 3rd Street. The traffic light ahead was yellow, but James could see it was about to turn red. He had two choices: slam on his brakes and risk the car behind him rear-ending him, or continue through the intersection. James made a split-second decision and pressed the accelerator, clearing the intersection just as the light turned red. That's when he saw the police car in his rearview mirror, lights flashing. James pulled over to the side of the road and put his hands on the steering wheel, exactly as he had been trained to do during his law enforcement career. He watched in his side mirror as a young officer approached his vehicle. The officer looked to be in his early 20s, with the kind of swagger that comes from being new to the job. "License and registration," the officer said before James could speak. "Good morning, officer. I'm Detective James Washington with the United States Secret Service. I'm currently responding to a federal security matter. My credentials are in my wallet in my back pocket. May I reach for them?" The officer's expression didn't change. "Yeah, right. Just give me your driver's license like everyone else. I don't have time for games this morning." James kept his voice calm and professional. "Officer, I understand your position, but I really am a federal agent. There's a credible threat against a federal judge, and I was asked to check his route to the courthouse. That's why I went through that yellow light. I can show you my badge and credentials if you'll allow me to reach for my wallet." "Look, buddy, I've heard every excuse in the book. Running a red light is running a red light. I don't care if you claim to be the president. License and registration now." The situation was escalating in a way that made James uncomfortable. He had dealt with local police officers before, and most were professional and respectful when federal agents identified themselves. This officer seemed determined not to listen. "Officer, what's your name?" James asked, still keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Officer Rodriguez, and you're getting a ticket whether you like it or not. Now, are you going to give me your license, or do we need to make this more complicated?" James realized he was in a difficult position. He needed to get to the courthouse to complete his security check, but he also couldn't afford to escalate the situation unnecessarily. "Officer Rodriguez, I'm going to slowly reach for my wallet to get my driver's license. My federal credentials are also in there. Please don't be alarmed." As James reached toward his back pocket, Officer Rodriguez suddenly became agitated. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, I'm just reaching for my wallet like you asked." I said step out of the car. Now James had no choice but to comply. He slowly opened his car door and stepped out, his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. Other cars were slowing down as they passed, their drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Rodriguez ordered. "Officer, there's really no need for this. I'm a federal agent responding to a security threat. If you'll just let me show you my credentials." "I told you to turn around." James did as he was told, placing his hands on the roof of his car. He could feel Rodriguez's hand searching his pockets and removing his wallet. Behind him, he heard the officer flipping through the contents. There was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch forever. Then Rodriguez spoke again, but his tone had changed slightly. "These look fake to me. Anyone can buy badges online these days." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. His Secret Service credentials were official federal identification, complete with his photograph, badge number, and the official seal of the Department of Homeland Security. "Officer Rodriguez, those credentials are real. You can call the Secret Service field office to verify my identity. The number is on the back of my ID card. Nice try. What I see here is someone impersonating a federal officer, which is a felony. You're under arrest." The handcuffs clicked around James's wrists before he could protest further. He felt the cold metal against his skin and realized this situation had spiraled completely out of control. Other police cars were arriving now, their sirens adding to the chaos. "This is a mistake," James said as Rodriguez led him toward the patrol car. "There's a credible threat against a federal judge, and every minute we waste here is a minute that could matter for his safety." "Save it for the judge," Rodriguez replied, pushing James into the back seat of the police car. As they drove toward the police station, James's mind raced. He thought about Judge Mitchell, who might be in real danger while James sat helplessly in the back of a patrol car. He thought about his supervisor, who was probably wondering why James hadn't checked in. Most of all, he thought about how a simple traffic stop had turned into something that could derail not just his morning, but potentially his entire career. The police station was busy with the usual morning activity. Officers coming off the night shift mixed with those just beginning their day. James was processed like any other arrestee, fingerprinted and photographed, his personal belongings cataloged and stored. "I get one phone call, right?" James asked the desk sergeant. "Yeah, you get your call. Make it count." James knew he had to choose carefully. He could call his supervisor and explain what had happened, but that would mean admitting he had been arrested while on federal business. He could call a lawyer, but that would take time he didn't have. Or he could wait and hope that someone would eventually listen to reason. As he sat in the holding cell, James realized that this was about much more than a traffic violation. This was about respect, about assumptions, and about what happens when people don't listen to each other. He had spent his entire career protecting others, and now he found himself powerless to protect even himself. The irony wasn't lost on him that in 3 weeks he would be standing before a judge, hoping for justice in a system that had already failed him once that morning. 3 weeks had passed since that morning on Main Street, and Detective James Washington found himself walking up the steps of the downtown courthouse. The building was one of those old structures that was supposed to make you feel the weight of justice, with its tall columns and marble floors that echoed with every footstep. James had been in courthouses before, but always as a law enforcement officer working cases. Today he was here as a defendant. The charges against him were simple but serious: resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. According to Officer Rodriguez's report, James had been belligerent and uncooperative during the traffic stop. The report made no mention of James's federal credentials or his attempts to identify himself as a Secret Service agent. Reading it, you would think James was just another person trying to talk his way out of a ticket. James's court-appointed attorney was a tired-looking man named David Chen who carried a briefcase that had seen better days. They had met only once before this morning, in a brief 15-minute conference where Chen had reviewed the charges and suggested James consider pleading guilty to a lesser offense. "Look, Mr. Washington," Chen had said during their meeting, "these cases are pretty straightforward. You ran a red light. The officer tried to give you a ticket and things escalated. The prosecutor is willing to reduce the charges if you plead no contest. You'd pay a fine and maybe do some community service. It's really the best option." James had tried to explain about his federal employment and the circumstances of his arrest, but Chen seemed more interested in moving through his caseload than in understanding the details. "I've heard a lot of stories over the years," Chen had said. "The judges have heard them all too. Sometimes it's better to just accept responsibility and move on." Now, as James sat in the gallery waiting for his case to be called, he watched the morning routine of municipal court unfold. Judge Harrison presided over the courtroom with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. Case after case was called. Defendants approached the bench and decisions were made in a matter of minutes. Judge Harrison was a man in his late 50s who had been on the bench for nearly 20 years. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, though James noticed that his definition of fairness seemed to depend heavily on his mood and the time of day. The morning cases moved quickly, with most defendants accepting plea bargains or having their cases continued to another date. James observed the pattern. When well-dressed defendants approached the bench, Judge Harrison's tone was polite and professional. When defendants who looked like they couldn't afford good lawyers came forward, his demeanor became noticeably cooler. James began to understand what kind of morning this was going to be. "Next case, People versus James Washington," the bailiff called out. James stood up and walked toward the defendant's table, his shoes clicking on the marble floor. He had dressed carefully for court, wearing his best suit and tie, hoping to make a good impression. As he took his seat next to Attorney Chen, he caught Judge Harrison looking at him with what seemed like mild annoyance, as if James's very presence was an inconvenience. The prosecutor, a young woman who looked like she had just graduated from law school, stood up and read the charges in a monotone voice. "Your Honor, the defendant is charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct stemming from an incident that occurred on Main Street on the morning of March 15th. According to the arresting officer's report, the defendant ran a red light and became belligerent when stopped. When the officer attempted to issue a citation, the defendant refused to comply with lawful orders and had to be physically restrained." Judge Harrison nodded, as if he had heard this same story 100 times before. "Mr. Washington, how do you plead to these charges?" James stood up. "Not guilty, Your Honor." "I see. Mr. Chen, is your client interested in discussing a plea agreement?" Chen started to respond, but James interrupted. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like the opportunity to explain the circumstances of my arrest." Judge Harrison's expression shifted slightly, and not in a good way. "Mr. Washington, this is an arraignment, not a trial. You'll have plenty of opportunity to tell your story if this case goes forward. For now, I just need your plea." "I understand, Your Honor, but there are important facts about this case that I believe the court should know. I am a federal law enforcement officer, and I was responding to a security threat when this incident occurred." The courtroom fell silent for a moment. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair and studied James with new interest. Though James couldn't tell if it was good interest or bad interest. "Mr. Washington, are you telling this court that you're a police officer?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'm a detective with the United States Secret Service. I was responding to a credible threat against a federal judge when I was pulled over. I tried to identify myself to the arresting officer, but he refused to look at my credentials." Judge Harrison's expression was unreadable. "Mr. Washington, if you're a federal agent, why didn't you just show your badge to the officer?" "I tried to, Your Honor. I asked for permission to reach for my wallet so I could show him my credentials, but Officer Rodriguez told me to keep my hands visible, and then ordered me out of the car before I could retrieve them." The prosecutor looked confused and began flipping through her file. Clearly, this information wasn't in the police report she had been given. Judge Harrison noticed her confusion and frowned. "Ms. Peterson, was the defendant's alleged law enforcement status mentioned in the police report?" "No, Your Honor. The report states that the defendant claimed to be some sort of federal agent, but Officer Rodriguez believed it was a fabrication designed to avoid getting a ticket." James felt his stomach sink. So Rodriguez had mentioned his claims in the report, but had dismissed them as lies. This was worse than he had thought. Judge Harrison turned back to James. "Mr. Washington, do you have any documentation of your employment with you today?" "Yes, Your Honor, I have my federal credentials and badge with me." "May I see them?" James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his leather credential case. He opened it to reveal his official Secret Service badge and identification card, then handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Judge Harrison examined the credentials carefully, holding them up to the light and studying the official seals and security features. The courtroom remained silent as he took his time reviewing them. Finally, he handed them back to the bailiff. "These appear to be genuine," Judge Harrison said. "Mr. Washington, if you're truly a federal agent, this puts a different complexion on things. However, the charges against you are still serious. Federal agent or not, you're not above the law." James felt a glimmer of hope. At least Judge Harrison was listening to him, which was more than Officer Rodriguez had done. "Your Honor, I completely understand that, and I have the utmost respect for the law. That's why I'm hoping this court will consider the full circumstances of what happened that morning. I was not trying to evade a traffic citation. I was responding to a legitimate federal security matter. Judge Harrison seemed to be considering this information when the prosecutor spoke up. Your Honor, even if the defendant is a federal agent, that doesn't give him the right to disregard traffic laws or resist arrest. The charges should stand. Mr. Washington, Judge Harrison said, can you provide any documentation of this alleged security threat you were responding to? James hesitated. The threat assessment against Judge Mitchell was classified information that he couldn't discuss in open court without proper authorization from his superiors. This put him in an impossible position. Your Honor, the nature of the threat is classified. I would need to get authorization from my supervisor before I could discuss the details in open court. Judge Harrison's expression hardened. Mr. Washington, you're asking this court to dismiss serious charges based on classified information that you can't or won't share. That's a difficult position to put the court in. James realized he was losing ground. Your Honor, I'm not asking for the charges to be dismissed based on classified information. I'm simply asking that the court consider the fact that I was acting in my official capacity as a federal law enforcement officer when this incident occurred. The back and forth continued for several more minutes, with James trying to explain his position and Judge Harrison becoming increasingly skeptical. What had started as a glimmer of hope was turning into something much more complicated. James could see that his federal credentials had gotten the judge's attention, but they hadn't solved his problem. Finally, Judge Harrison made his decision. Mr. Washington, I'm going to continue this case for 2 weeks to give you time to obtain proper documentation from your superiors regarding this alleged security matter. If you can provide credible evidence that you were acting in your official capacity, we'll revisit these charges. Until then, you're released on your own recognizance. As James left the courtroom that morning, he realized that his real fight was just beginning. 2 weeks later, James Washington was back in the same courtroom, but this time things felt different. The morning rush was just as chaotic as before, with defendants checking in with their lawyers and families sitting nervously in the gallery. James had spent the previous 2 weeks working with his supervisor to get the proper documentation for his case, but the process had been more complicated than he expected. The Secret Service took a dim view of their agents appearing in local courts, even as defendants. James had to write detailed reports explaining exactly what had happened that morning, and his supervisor had to get approval from higher up the chain to release any information about the threat assessment against Judge Mitchell. In the end, they were able to provide a letter confirming that James had been on official business that morning. But the details of the threat had to remain classified. James's court-appointed attorney, David Chen, was no more enthusiastic about the case than he had been 2 weeks earlier. When James showed him the letter from the Secret Service, Chen had simply shrugged and said, "Well, that's something, I guess." But judges don't like it when people try to use their jobs to get out of trouble. Now, as James sat waiting for his case to be called, he watched Judge Harrison work through the morning docket. The judge seemed to be in a particularly bad mood, snapping at lawyers who weren't prepared and showing little patience for defendants who tried to explain their situations. Several cases before James involved people who claimed they had good reasons for breaking the law, and Judge Harrison had dismissed each explanation with increasing irritation. "Your Honor, I was rushing to the hospital because my wife was in labor," one defendant had explained. "Congratulations on becoming a father," Judge Harrison had replied sarcastically. "That'll be a $200 fine and 3 points on your license." Another defendant claimed he had been speeding because he was late for a job interview. Judge Harrison's response was even less sympathetic. "Maybe next time you'll leave earlier. $400 and defensive driving school." James was beginning to understand that Judge Harrison was not in the mood for excuses, no matter how reasonable they might seem. When his case was finally called, James approached the defendant's table with a growing sense of dread. "Mr. Washington," Judge Harrison said without looking up from his paperwork, "I trust you've had enough time to get your affairs in order." "Yes, Your Honor. My attorney has a letter from my supervisor confirming that I was on official business that morning." Judge Harrison finally looked up, and James could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Let me see this letter." Chen handed the letter to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Judge Harrison read it slowly, his expression growing more annoyed with each line. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked directly at James. Mr. Washington, this letter is quite interesting. It confirms that you work for the Secret Service and that you were supposedly responding to some sort of security matter on the morning in question, but it doesn't say anything specific about what that security matter was or why it required you to run red lights. James stood up. Your Honor, as I explained previously, the specific details of the threat are classified, but the letter confirms that I was acting in my official capacity. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, and James could see something change in his expression. What had been skepticism was turning into something closer to contempt. Mr. Washington, let me tell you something. In 20 years on this bench, I've seen every excuse imaginable. I've had people tell me they were late for their grandmother's funeral, rushing to save a dying pet, and even claiming they were undercover CIA agents. Your story is creative, I'll give you that. The words hit James like a physical blow. Judge Harrison didn't believe him. Despite the federal credentials, despite the letter from his supervisor, the judge thought James was lying. Your Honor, I'm not making excuses. I'm simply trying to explain the circumstances. Oh, you're explaining all right, Judge Harrison interrupted, and now there was actual amusement in his voice. You're explaining how you think you're so important that traffic laws don't apply to you. You're explaining how you think flashing a badge should get you out of any trouble. James felt heat rising in his face. The judge's tone was becoming increasingly mocking, and other people in the courtroom were starting to pay attention. Your Honor, that's not what I'm saying at all. Really? Because from where I sit, it looks like you got caught running a red light and now you're trying to use your job to wiggle out of the consequences. What's next? Are you going to tell me you were chasing international terrorists through downtown traffic? A few people in the gallery actually chuckled at this, and James felt his humiliation deepen. Judge Harrison was making fun of him in open court, treating his legitimate explanation like a joke. Your Honor, I understand your skepticism, but I can assure you that everything I've told this court is the truth. The truth? Judge Harrison's voice rose slightly. The truth is that you think you're better than everyone else who has to follow the rules. The truth is that you're standing in my courtroom trying to convince me that your job makes you special. James's attorney tried to intervene. Your Honor, if I may— You may not, Judge Harrison snapped. I'm talking to your client right now. He turned back to James. Do you know what I think, Mr. Washington? I think you bought that badge online and had someone type up that letter. I think you're running an elaborate scam to try to impress this court. The accusation was so outrageous that James almost couldn't believe he was hearing it. Your Honor, those credentials are genuine federal identification. You examined them yourself 2 weeks ago. Oh, I remember examining them. Very impressive. Professional looking. But you know what? You can buy anything on the internet these days. Hollywood prop departments make badges that look just as real as yours. James felt the situation spiraling completely out of control. Your Honor, if you have any doubts about my credentials, you can call the Secret Service field office to verify my employment. The number is right on my identification card. Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. Mr. Washington, do you really think I'm going to waste the court's time calling some phone number that you probably set up yourself? Do you think I was born yesterday? The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing and was staring at the scene unfolding before her. James could feel dozens of eyes on him as Judge Harrison continued his verbal assault. You know what really bothers me about cases like this? Judge Harrison continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It's the arrogance. The absolute arrogance of someone who thinks they can walk into my courtroom and spin some fantasy story about being a federal agent. Do you think I'm stupid, Mr. Washington? No, Your Honor, I don't think you're stupid. I think you're making a mistake. A mistake? Judge Harrison's voice rose to nearly a shout. The only mistake here is that you thought you could come into my courtroom and make a fool out of me. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Washington. I've been dealing with people like you for 20 years, and I can spot a liar from across the room. James felt something inside him snap. For weeks he had tried to handle this situation with dignity and professionalism. He had followed proper procedures, obtained documentation from his superiors, and approached the court with respect. And in return, he was being humiliated and called a liar by a judge who had clearly made up his mind before hearing any evidence. Your Honor, James said, his voice steady, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. I have been nothing but truthful with this court. I have provided my genuine federal credentials and official documentation from my employer. If you choose not to believe that evidence, that is your decision. But I will not stand here and be accused of fraud when I have done nothing but tell the truth." Judge Harrison's face flushed red. "Are you lecturing me about evidence, Mr. Washington? Are you telling me how to do my job?" "No, Your Honor. I'm simply asking to be treated with the same respect that any citizen deserves in a court of law." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Harrison stared at James for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing on his words before spitting them out. "Respect," he finally said. "You want respect? How about you show some respect for this court and stop wasting everyone's time with your ridiculous stories? How about you take responsibility for your actions like a grown man instead of hiding behind some fantasy about being a secret agent?" James realized that nothing he could say would change Judge Harrison's mind. The judge had decided that James was a liar, and no amount of evidence was going to convince him otherwise. All James could do now was maintain his dignity and hope that someone somewhere would eventually listen to reason. But as he stood there being mocked and humiliated in front of a courtroom full of strangers, James made a decision. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his credential case one more time. Judge Harrison might not believe his words, but maybe it was time to let his badge speak for itself. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Harrison had just finished his harsh words about respect and fantasy stories, and James Washington stood at the defendant's table with his credential case in his hand. The gallery had gone completely silent, with everyone sensing that something significant was about to happen. James looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the people watching him. There was his attorney, David Chen, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. There was the young prosecutor, who seemed uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. There were the other defendants waiting for their cases to be called, some looking sympathetic and others just wanting to get their own business over with. And there was Judge Harrison, sitting behind his bench with an expression of smug satisfaction, clearly believing he had put James in his place. James had spent 15 years in federal law enforcement. He had protected presidents and foreign dignitaries. He had investigated threats against the highest levels of government. He had been trained to remain calm under pressure and to handle confrontational situations with professionalism. But standing in that courtroom, being publicly humiliated and called a liar, James felt something he rarely experienced: anger. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes people do stupid things. This was a cold, controlled anger that came from being disrespected in the most fundamental way possible. Judge Harrison wasn't just questioning James's story. He was questioning James's character, his integrity, and his worth as a human being. James took a deep breath and made his decision. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and clear. "May I approach the bench?" Judge Harrison looked surprised by the request. In most municipal courts, defendants don't approach the bench unless specifically invited, but there was something in James's tone that made the judge pause. "For what purpose, Mr. Washington? I'd like to show you something that might clarify the situation." Judge Harrison glanced at the prosecutor, who shrugged, and then at James's attorney, who looked like he was about to object but thought better of it. "Very well, approach." James walked slowly toward the bench, his footsteps echoing in the silent courtroom. As he got closer, he could see Judge Harrison's expression more clearly. The judge was trying to maintain his air of authority, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was beginning to have doubts about the course this hearing had taken. When James reached the bench, he stopped and looked directly at Judge Harrison. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, sizing each other up like opponents in a chess match. "Your Honor," James said quietly, "you've made it clear that you don't believe my credentials are genuine. You think I'm running some kind of scam to get out of a traffic ticket? I understand your skepticism, and I don't blame you for being cautious. But I think it's time you took a closer look at exactly who you're dealing with." James opened his credential case and carefully removed his badge and identification card. But this time, instead of just showing them to the judge, he placed them directly on the bench in front of Judge Harrison. The badge gleamed under the courtroom lights. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, with the official seal of the United States Secret Service etched in gold and silver. The words United States Secret Service were clearly visible, along with James's badge number and the Department of Homeland Security logo. Judge Harrison picked up the badge and examined it more closely than he had 2 weeks earlier. James watched as the judge's fingers traced the edges, feeling for the weight and quality that distinguished genuine federal badges from cheap imitations. He saw Judge Harrison hold the badge up to the light, checking for the security features that were built into all official government credentials. The identification card was equally impressive. James's photograph was embedded in the card using the same technology used for passports and other high-security documents. His full name, badge number, and official title were printed in official government fonts. The card included multiple security features, holograms, special inks, and embedded chips that would be impossible to replicate. As Judge Harrison continued his examination, James could see the change beginning to happen. The judge's expression was shifting from skepticism to uncertainty to something that looked very much like concern. "Your Honor," James said softly, "I need you to understand something. I'm not some random person trying to talk his way out of a ticket. I'm not someone who bought a fake badge online or made up a story about being a federal agent. I am Detective James Washington, badge number 1847, United States Secret Service, assigned to the Washington Field Office. I have been a federal law enforcement officer for 15 years. I have protected 3 different presidents and countless other high-ranking officials. I have never been arrested before in my life, and I have never lied to a court." Judge Harrison set the badge down and picked up the identification card, studying it with the same intensity. James could see sweat beginning to form on the judge's forehead. "The morning I was arrested," James continued, "I was responding to a credible threat against federal Judge Mitchell. The threat was specific and detailed, and it required immediate investigation. That's why I was driving the route Judge Mitchell takes to work. That's why I went through that yellow light, and that's why I tried so desperately to identify myself to Officer Rodriguez." James reached into his jacket and pulled out another document. "Your Honor, this is a copy of the original threat assessment report from that morning. I've been authorized by my superiors to show it to you, with certain classified details redacted." Judge Harrison took the document with hands that James noticed were now trembling slightly. As the judge read, James could see his face growing paler. "As you can see," James said, "the threat was real, it was serious, and it required an immediate response. I wasn't joking around or trying to get out of a ticket. I was doing my job, trying to protect a federal judge whose life might have been in danger." Judge Harrison finished reading the document and set it down next to the badge and ID card. For a long moment, he just stared at the items on his bench, as if trying to process what he was seeing. "Your Honor," James said, his voice barely above a whisper, 3 weeks ago, you examined these same credentials and told the court they appeared to be genuine. Today you suggested they were props bought on the internet. What changed between then and now?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Judge Harrison looked up at James, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, James saw something in the judge's eyes that looked like shame. "Mr. Washington," Judge Harrison said, his voice much quieter than it had been moments earlier. I need to take a brief recess to review this evidence." "Your Honor," James said, "I think we both know what this evidence shows. The question is what you're going to do about it." Judge Harrison looked around the courtroom, suddenly seeming to realize that dozens of people had just witnessed him humiliate a federal law enforcement officer based on nothing more than his own prejudices and assumptions. "Detective Washington," the judge said, and James noticed he was using his title for the first time. "I owe you an apology." "Your Honor," James replied, "what you owe me is justice." The word justice seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. James picked up his badge and credentials and returned them to his wallet. He had made his point, and now it was time to see what Judge Harrison would do with the truth that was sitting right in front of him. As James walked back to the defendant's table, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom following him. He had just done something that most defendants never get the chance to do. He had forced a judge to confront the reality of his own mistakes. Now came the hard part. Judge Harrison had to decide whether he was big enough to admit he had been wrong, or whether his pride would prevent him from doing the right thing. James sat down next to his attorney and waited to find out which kind of judge he was really dealing with. Judge Harrison sat behind his bench in complete silence, staring at the papers and credentials that James had placed before him. The courtroom remained frozen in that uncomfortable quiet that follows a moment when everyone realizes something important has just happened. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands poised over her machine as she waited to see what would happen next. James watched the judge's face carefully. He could see the internal struggle taking place as Judge Harrison processed the reality of the situation. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. This was about a federal law enforcement officer who had been arrested while responding to a legitimate security threat, and then publicly humiliated in court by a judge who had refused to listen to the truth. Finally, Judge Harrison cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Detective Washington, would you please approach the bench again?" James stood up and walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the silent courtroom. When he reached the bench, Judge Harrison was looking down at his hands, unable to meet James's eyes. "Detective Washington," the judge said, "I owe you much more than an apology. I owe you a complete and public acknowledgement that I was wrong, not just about the facts of your case, but about the way I treated you in my courtroom." Judge Harrison looked up and addressed the entire courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have just witnessed is a failure of this court. I allowed my own assumptions and prejudices to cloud my judgment, and as a result, I have treated a dedicated federal law enforcement officer with disrespect and contempt that he did not deserve." The judge turned back to James. "Detective Washington, all charges against you are hereby dismissed. The arrest that morning was the result of a misunderstanding that could have been avoided if Officer Rodriguez had taken the time to properly examine your credentials. Your conduct that morning was entirely appropriate for a federal agent responding to a security threat." James nodded, but he could see that Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I want it noted in the court record that Detective Washington conducted himself with professionalism and dignity throughout these proceedings, even when he was being treated unfairly by this court. His behavior today has been exemplary, and he has my sincere apologies." The courtroom began to stir as people realized the dramatic turn the case had taken. James could hear whispers and murmurs as the spectators discussed what they had just witnessed. "Your Honor," James said, "I appreciate your apology, and I accept it, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about me. This is about what happens when people in positions of authority refuse to listen, refuse to consider that they might be wrong, and refuse to treat others with basic dignity and respect." Judge Harrison nodded. "You're absolutely right, Detective Washington. And I want you to know that I intend to take steps to ensure that something like this never happens again in my courtroom." James looked at the judge for a long moment, trying to decide whether his words were sincere or just damage control. Finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, I've spent 15 years in federal law enforcement. I've seen good people and bad people in every profession, including my own. What I've learned is that being in a position of authority doesn't make you right. It just gives you the power to do more damage when you're wrong." The words hit their mark. Judge Harrison's face flushed, and James could see that the message had been received. "Detective Washington," the judge said, "you mentioned that this incident would be reported to federal authorities. I assume that means there will be consequences for what happened here today." James had been wondering when this topic would come up. The truth was that he was required to report the incident to his superiors, and they would likely file a formal complaint about his treatment. But looking at Judge Harrison now, James could see a man who was genuinely remorseful about his actions. "Your Honor, I will be filing a report about these proceedings, yes, but I'll also be including your apology and your acknowledgement of the problems with how this case was handled. What happens after that will be up to people above my pay grade." Judge Harrison nodded. "I understand. And Detective Washington, for what it's worth, I think those people above your pay grade are lucky to have someone like you working for them." As James prepared to leave the courtroom, he thought about the lessons of the past few weeks. He had learned that justice isn't automatic even in a courtroom. Sometimes you have to fight for it, even when you shouldn't have to. He had learned that respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you have to earn by your actions, even in the face of disrespect from others. Most importantly, he had learned that standing up for yourself isn't just about personal pride. It's about principle. If he had simply accepted Judge Harrison's treatment without fighting back, it would have sent a message that such behavior was acceptable. By forcing the judge to confront the truth, James had done something that might prevent the next person from being treated the same way. Outside the courtroom, James's attorney, David Chen, caught up with him. "Detective Washington, I have to say, I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of practice." The way you handled yourself in there was remarkable. James shook his head. Mr. Chen, I shouldn't have had to handle myself at all. The system should have worked the way it was supposed to work from the beginning. You're right, Chen agreed. But the system is made up of people, and people make mistakes. The difference is what happens when those mistakes are pointed out. Judge Harrison could have doubled down and made things worse. Instead, he admitted he was wrong. That takes courage. James considered this. Maybe. But it shouldn't take courage to admit you made a mistake. It should just be the right thing to do. Over the following weeks, the story of what happened in Judge Harrison's courtroom spread through legal circles. Some people focused on the dramatic moment when James revealed his credentials. Others talked about Judge Harrison's public apology and acknowledgement of his mistakes. But for James, the most important outcome was a policy change that Judge Harrison implemented in his courtroom. From that day forward, any defendant who claimed to be a law enforcement officer would have their credentials verified through official channels before their case proceeded. It was a small change, but it meant that no other officer would have to go through what James had experienced. Judge Harrison also instituted mandatory training for all court personnel on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. He personally attended every session, sending a clear message that these issues were important enough to command the attention of everyone in the courthouse. 6 months later, James received a letter from Judge Harrison. In it, the judge thanked him for forcing a conversation that needed to happen. He wrote that the incident had made him a better judge and a better person, and he hoped that James could forgive him for the way he had been treated. James wrote back, telling Judge Harrison that forgiveness wasn't the point. The point was learning and growing and making sure that justice really was blind, not to the facts, but to the prejudices and assumptions that could prevent the truth from being heard. Looking back on the whole experience, James realized that sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones where you have to decide whether to stand up or sit down, whether to speak up or stay quiet, whether to accept injustice or fight for what's right. In the end, he was glad he had chosen to stand up, not just for himself but for everyone who might find themselves in a similar situation in the future, because that's what justice really means, not just getting the right outcome for yourself, but making sure the system works better for everyone who comes after you. The badge in James's wallet wasn't just a symbol of his authority as a federal agent. It was a symbol of his commitment to justice, fairness, and the principle that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That morning in court, when he placed that badge on Judge Harrison's bench, he wasn't just proving who he was. He was proving what he stood for. And in the end, that made all the difference.